My brothers, my sisters, welcome back to the channel. Today we speak not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa's awakening. If you believe in freedom, unity, and the power of our people, then make sure you subscribe. Share this story, and let the world hear Africa's voice. Because what you are about to witness is not just history, that is destiny. It began with a storm that wasn't made of clouds. No thunder, no rain, and only headlines. United States enforces tariff sanctions against Burkina Faso. A single sentence that rippled through continents, drowning a small nation in a tide of fear. Television anchors spoke of it like a minor policy, a bureaucratic correction to an unstable African state. But in Ouagadougou, the air felt heavier. Markets froze, traders whispered. Mothers counted their last coins, and in the presidential palace, under flickering fluorescent lights, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone, staring at the document that declared his country's economic suffocation. The Americans had signed their decree. The European Union followed quietly, pretending neutrality while securing their own gold routes elsewhere. And the IMF, smiling like a wolf in silk, sent its congratulations to Washington. No one in the world expected Burkina Faso to survive more than 3 months. The tariffs targeted everything: exports, imports, digital payments, banking systems. The world's financial arteries were closing around one landlocked country. For Western media, it was justice. For Africa, it was a warning. Yet, beneath the surface of despair, something silent began to move. The lights in the city dimmed. Power stations rationed energy. ATMs ran dry. Children sold fruit by candlelight. Soldiers guarded gas stations like fortresses. Burkina Faso's heartbeat slowed, but it did not stop. Inside his office, Traoré's aides begged for compromise. They spoke of back channels, trade negotiations, the need to speak softly with Washington. But Traoré didn't answer. He simply picked up a pen, opened a fresh page in his leather-bound notebook, and wrote 8 words: "Let the world see what we endure." Those words would ignite the story of a generation. Months before the sanctions, the tension had already been building. Traoré's government had taken radical steps, nationalizing foreign-controlled gold mines, expelling Western military contractors, reclaiming lithium fields that had been leased for pennies. For the first time, Burkina Faso was dictating its own economic terms, but independence came with a price. Washington saw it as defiance. London called it reckless populism. The IMF issued quiet threats: reconsider or face isolation. Still, Traoré pressed forward. He wasn't chasing power, he was chasing dignity. He believed that Africa could not beg for fairness. It had to build it, but the empire never sleeps. When the meetings failed, the letters began. Veiled ultimatums, carefully worded threats, digital surveillance creeping into the nation's systems. And when words didn't work, the hammer fell. Tariffs. That's how it began. The quiet war of numbers and hunger. By the second week, cargo ships stopped docking in Abidjan, the port that fed Burkina Faso's imports. By the third, fuel prices tripled. And by the end of the first month, banks in Paris and New York froze every Burkinabe transaction, from copper exports to food shipments. On the surface, it was just policy. But beneath it, starvation. Children fainted in classrooms. Markets turned into ghost towns. Hospitals rationed oxygen. And the world turned the page, as if nothing happened. But something inside Traoré refused to die. Every crisis meeting ended with the same question: what do we have that they can't sanction? And every night, the same answer echoed in his mind: our will. In the midst of the chaos, a memory returned. A voice from the past, echoing through the corridors of Burkina's history. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who once stood where Traoré stood now, the man who dreamed of an Africa free from debt, free from dependence. Sankara was betrayed, assassinated, and erased by those who feared a self-sufficient Africa. Now his ghost lingered in the silence of power. Traoré often visited the statue built in Sankara's honor, a bronze figure staring defiantly toward the horizon. There he whispered not prayers but promises, that he would finish what Sankara began, that Burkina Faso would not kneel again. But while the young leader dreamed, others plotted. 3 powerful men, all high-ranking officers, watched the crisis unfold with hidden satisfaction. They had built careers on foreign contracts, corporate favors, and quiet corruption. The tariffs were their opportunity. If Traoré fell, they would be ready to rise. In the capital's dim-lit villas, whispers filled the air of coups, of deals with friendly governments, of gold shipments that disappeared before dawn. Traoré knew. He saw their names in intelligence reports, but he stayed silent, watching, waiting. He understood that betrayal doesn't strike with bullets first. It begins with smiles. Meanwhile, the world moved on. On global television, Western leaders framed the sanctions as necessary discipline. They spoke of democracy, trade balance, and global order, but never hunger. Never the mothers walking miles for water. Never the soldiers guarding empty warehouses. Never the street vendors who whispered, "Will we eat tomorrow?" At night, the streets of Ouagadougou fell silent, not because people slept, but because they had nothing left to say. Traoré watched from his window as the lights of his capital blinked out, one district at a time. He felt the weight of his people's despair pressing on his chest. Every policy, every decision, all of it seemed to lead toward one brutal truth. He was being suffocated for refusing to kneel. But in the suffocation, he found clarity. They wanted his surrender. He would give them something else, a counterattack they couldn't predict. While the world mocked him as a failed leader, Traoré quietly assembled a small team of economists, coders, and trade experts. They met in secret, not in government halls, but in abandoned warehouses where no signal reached. There, under the hum of dying generators, they built something radical, a network designed to make the tariffs meaningless. It wasn't a weapon. It was an idea, a digital ecosystem built from African ingenuity, not Western permission, something that would later be whispered across Africa as the network. But in those early days, it was fragile. One wrong move, and the Americans would detect it, crush it, and erase its creators from existence. Traoré was gambling everything. Not just his presidency, his life, his country's survival. By now, the US State Department was watching closely. Intelligence briefings painted Traoré as unstable, a populist military idealist, they called him. Washington's analysts debated whether to fund covert destabilization or full diplomatic isolation. But one man, sitting in the Oval Office, saw it differently. For Donald Trump, the sanctions weren't just policy. They were theater. He wanted victory headlines before the upcoming election cycle. He wanted to prove that no African dictator could outsmart America. And so he waited for Traoré's collapse, confident it was inevitable. But as weeks turned into months, something unexpected happened. Burkina Faso didn't collapse, it adapted. Markets found alternate routes through hidden trade corridors in Mali and Niger. Local industries revived, small barter networks replaced imports, and whispers spread across West Africa. Traoré hasn't fallen. For Washington, it was an embarrassment. For Traoré, it was a beginning. By the 3rd month, hunger had turned to resolve. The people, exhausted and desperate, began to see their leader not as a soldier, but as the last line between them and submission. Volunteers guarded local farms. Students worked in fields. The army transported food instead of weapons. Burkina Faso was bleeding, but it was breathing through unity. And as his country began to adapt, Traoré started writing. Not speeches, not press releases. A single letter, handwritten, sealed with the national crest. Addressed not to a nation, but to a man, President Donald J. Trump. No one knew what the letter contained, only that it was quietly delivered through diplomatic back channels, and that, hours later, the US Treasury postponed its next round of sanctions. What could one man possibly have written that made the world's most powerful administration hesitate? The world would soon find out. Days later, as cameras rolled across global networks, an unannounced broadcast appeared on every African state channel. The feed was live from Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré at his desk, a calm fire in his eyes. The world froze. The letter had not been private, after all. It was a message to the world, a challenge wrapped in truth. The transmission cut suddenly after a few minutes, leaving only one final sentence echoing across the screen. If justice is punished, then let punishment become justice. That night, Washington went silent. The State Department scrambled for statements. The markets trembled. And for the first time in decades, Africa's silence was not submission. It was suspense. Because what Traoré did next would leave the entire world speechless. The world thought it had seen the end of Ibrahim Traoré. But his silence was not surrender, it was calculation. Behind the smoke and starvation, behind the public despair, something invisible was taking shape. The Americans didn't see it. The Europeans dismissed it as desperation. But in the shadows of West Africa, the seeds of a counter-system were beginning to grow. One that would not beg for inclusion, but rewrite the rules of inclusion itself. It started with whispers, untraceable signals traveling through broken cell towers and smuggled laptops. A few lines of code written in basements, shared on encrypted drives, powered by generators that sputtered in the night. They called it Project Amani, Swahili for peace. But peace was the last thing it would bring to the old world order. Under Traoré's quiet directive, economists, hackers, and small-scale traders collaborated to design a decentralized financial web, a network capable of operating outside the reach of global banks. A system that didn't need dollars, euros, or permission. Transactions in gold, grain, copper, and digital credits. A mirror economy, invisible to Western satellites, yet pulsing beneath their feet. To the world, Burkina Faso was collapsing. In reality, it was mutating, and every day, more nations began listening. Mali, Niger, Guinea, all struggling, all sanctioned, all desperate, all ready. But Washington was not blind for long. By mid-year, American analysts began detecting irregular trade surges between African nations. Tiny countries with no banking capacity suddenly exchanging commodities worth millions. Gold shipments rerouted through the Sahara. Copper trades logged without currency records. It was an economic ghost, untraceable, decentralized, unstoppable. When the reports reached the Oval Office, Trump's advisors were divided. Some laughed, calling it primitive bartering. Others saw something terrifying, an Africa no longer dependent on the dollar. And in the world of power, independence is rebellion. Washington escalated. Cyber teams were deployed to intercept Burkina servers. Trade embassies were infiltrated. Spies posing as journalists arrived in Ouagadougou, offering interviews that were really interrogations. Every global headline mocked Traoré as an isolated nationalist, unaware that the system he'd birthed was spreading beneath their networks. Quiet as roots, inevitable as dawn. But for his people, the suffering was real. Food shortages deepened. The streets smelled of sweat and diesel, a city trying to survive starvation with dignity. Traoré knew that every night, someone went to bed hungry because of a decision he refused to reverse. And that knowledge became his greatest torment. In the capital, the three generals watched the famine grow. They saw their chance. They whispered in corridors, promising relief, offering partnership with American envoys. If Traoré stepped down, the sanctions would lift. Burkina Faso would re-enter the international family, but the people had changed. They had seen too much manipulation, too many false smiles, and when one of the generals was caught meeting a US diplomat under the cover of night, the rumors ignited like wildfire. Traoré didn't have to act. The nation acted for him. The general's mansion was burned to the ground by protesters before sunrise. The empire had underestimated the one thing that couldn't be sanctioned: belief. Then, the world trembled. A file appeared on global networks, leaked through anonymous channels, stamped with US government metadata. It contained hundreds of classified memos, emails, trade contracts, and internal communications. They revealed that the sanctions were never about human rights or democracy. They were designed by lobbyists from oil and mining corporations, desperate to regain control of African resources. One memo, signed by an American advisor, said bluntly, "Our interests are not political. They're mineral." The leak spread like wildfire. Global outrage erupted. Students marched in Paris, activists protested in New York. Even Western journalists began asking questions that had long been forbidden. For the first time, Traoré wasn't the villain. He was the victim, and more dangerously, the mirror reflecting the world's hypocrisy. Humiliated, the IMF and Western banks struck back. They froze African loans, crippled humanitarian aid, and blocked African tech companies from using international cloud servers. To them, Traoré was now a contagion, an infection threatening to inspire other nations. But Burkina Faso adapted again. The network grew faster under pressure. Tech hubs emerged in abandoned buildings. Farmers used mobile phones as trading terminals. Currency became digital, local, and alive. The sanctions had accidentally created a prototype for economic independence. The world watched in disbelief as satellite images showed new construction sites in Ouagadougou, energy stations, data centers, small manufacturing units, all built without foreign funding. What is he doing? Analysts asked. No one could answer. Then a new layer of mystery. Satellite intercepts detected encrypted messages between Ouagadougou and unknown frequencies traced near Moscow and Beijing. Some claimed Russia was aiding Traoré's digital economy. Others believed it was disinformation planted by the CIA to justify a larger response. No one truly knew. But something was happening behind the curtains of geopolitics, a quiet realignment. Trump's administration, caught between pride and paranoia, ordered surveillance drones over West Africa. Images showed secret convoys moving through the desert, armored trucks, unknown cargo, unmarked boxes. Rumors spread. Was Traoré building weapons? Or something worse, an alternative to the Western world itself? By now, the African underground economy was no longer underground. Millions of citizens across multiple nations used the network to trade food, medicine, and tools. Burkina Faso had gone from isolated to influential. A silent revolution was in motion, but power attracts enemies. One night, an explosion shattered the quiet of Ouagadougou, a fuel depot engulfed in flames. Western media called it an accident. Local sources said it was sabotage. For the first time since the crisis began, Traoré appeared shaken. He had expected pressure, not assassination. And when investigators found fragments of a drone near the site, the message was clear. Someone wanted him erased. 2 weeks later, an audio file surfaced on independent African news channels. It contained a private phone conversation, the voice unmistakably that of a high-ranking American official. In it, he referred to Traoré as an obstacle to trade realignment and mentioned temporary removal by proxy. The clip spread across the internet before it could be deleted. The world erupted. Protests in African capitals, riots in front of U.S. embassies. Even American citizens began questioning the ethics of their own government. In 1 week, the narrative flipped again. Traoré was no longer an isolated revolutionary. He was a symbol of resistance, of dignity, of the global South standing up against silent oppression. But the leak and the chaos that followed were not coincidences. Somewhere in the shadows of power, a mysterious ally was moving strings. Anonymous accounts funneled data, exposed communications, leaked internal IMF reports, always with precise timing, always sparing Burkina Faso from exposure. Was it Russia? Was it a faction within Washington itself? No one knew, not even Traoré. He only knew one thing. Someone out there believed in the same cause, or wanted the same collapse. And in the world of politics, motives were currency more dangerous than gold. Meanwhile, within Burkina Faso, something extraordinary was happening. Despite hunger and scarcity, hope returned. Communities began producing their own goods again. Markets reopened using the network as payment. Local entrepreneurs thrived. What was once despair became defiance. Street artists painted Traoré's image across city walls, half soldier, half visionary. They called him the unbought man. Songs, poems, even children's books began carrying his message. We will not sell what our ancestors built. The empire had created a monster made of faith. In Washington, panic replaced arrogance. The sanctions that were meant to isolate one nation had instead connected a continent. Trade patterns shifted, data routes rerouted. The dollar's hold on African economies began to weaken. American economists called it the Traoré effect. Every spreadsheet looked wrong. Every prediction collapsed. Trump demanded action. His advisors warned against direct confrontation. The world was watching, and every move now risked exposing the empire's fear. But Trump was not a man of patience. He wanted to end the humiliation publicly, decisively. And so, he announced a global address to clarify America's position on the African sanctions. It was to be broadcast live from the White House with every camera trained on him. Behind closed doors, his staff prepared the speech carefully, painting Traoré as a destabilizing force who endangered global trade. But in the digital realm, a new player was waiting. Unknown to Washington, Traoré's tech network had infiltrated the global broadcast relay system through backdoors built months earlier. And when Trump's speech began, so did his silence. The feed glitched. The screen flickered, and across millions of devices worldwide, the face of the US president froze, replaced by a new transmission, a dark screen. A seal, a voice. It was Ibrahim Traoré. Not in anger, not in defiance, but calm, cold, steady. The world leaned closer to their screens, unsure if it was a hack or divine intervention. He didn't speak long, just long enough for one sentence. A message history would never forget. You cannot sanction the sun for rising. The transmission cut. The White House feed returned, Trump frozen, confused, blinking at the cameras. In that instant, the internet exploded. Memes, news, chaos. Traoré trended higher than any global leader in history. But beneath the humor and hysteria, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, the most powerful nation had been silenced by the weakest. The days that followed felt unreal. The world's media called it the broadcast coup. American analysts blamed hackers. But Africa knew the truth. It wasn't just technology. It was message over might. Traoré hadn't won a battle. He had changed the battlefield. The world was no longer watching in silence. It was listening. From the dusty plains of Ouagadougou to the steel towers of Washington, whispers of a storm echoed. The tariffs had shaken Burkina Faso's economy, but what no one expected was Traoré's answer. But before his reply came, the darkness thickened. In the months following Trump's declaration, container ships sat motionless in harbors, filled with cocoa, gold, and handmade crafts that could no longer reach foreign markets. American corporations froze contracts overnight. Farmers in Burkina Faso watched as their harvests rotted under the sun. The price of bread tripled, then vanished altogether. And amid it all, Ibrahim Traoré refused to kneel. He walked among his people without guards, without fanfare, and without promise, only presence. Mothers whispered prayers as he passed. Fathers clenched fists, their loyalty hardening like iron. He said little, but his silence spoke. We will not beg. Behind closed doors, however, the world was turning on him. The US Treasury issued secondary sanctions. African banks were threatened. Cut ties with Burkina Faso or lose access to the dollar. European leaders withdrew ambassadors. Western journalists painted Traoré as a rogue populist, a threat to international order. And then came the shadow diplomacy. In Paris, a secret memo circulated, neutralized Traoré's movement before December. In Washington, the Pentagon drafted contingency plans, Operation Red Sand. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré drafted something far more dangerous, a vision. Under the red flicker of oil lamps in a deserted military hall, he met his closest advisors. Maps of Africa were spread across the table, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Every empire, he said slowly, builds its walls on the backs of the poor. But what if the poor stop lifting? The men stared at him, confused. He smiled faintly. Let them keep their tariffs, he whispered. We will build our own world. And that was the birth of what history would call the Sankara Plan, an economic rebellion disguised as cooperation. Step 1. Redirect every export to African and Asian markets. Step 2. Convert trade into gold-backed credits instead of dollars. Step 3. Launch a continental trade bloc under Burkina Faso's leadership, independent from Western influence. It was bold, It was impossible, and it terrified Washington. By mid-year, news broke across global networks. Burkina Faso announces Gold Africa Initiative, a direct challenge to U.S. economic hegemony. CNN called it a tantrum. Fox News called it economic suicide. But on African soil, millions called it freedom. Markets reacted violently. The U.S. dollar surged. Oil prices spiked. Gold, Burkina's main export, reached record highs overnight. And yet, as the world panicked, Traoré's small nation grew strangely calm. Rural workshops reopened. Farmers received state-issued gold credits for their crops. Engineers from Mali, Ghana, and Tanzania poured into Ouagadougou. For the first time in modern history, an African nation had said no to America, and meant it. But the retaliation came swift and brutal. Late one evening, in a classified White House briefing, Trump slammed his hand on the desk. "Who does this guy think he is?" he growled. Shut him down. Within weeks, covert operations intensified. A media smear campaign exploded online. Photoshopped scandals, false reports of coups, leaked intelligence suggesting Traoré was working with terrorists. Then, on a cold December night, power went out across Burkina Faso. Every major city plunged into darkness. Phones went silent. Satellites jammed. It was economic warfare turned digital. Traoré's advisors panicked. "Sir, it's a cyber attack. They've hit our grids." But he didn't flinch. Instead, he ordered his soldiers to light fires in the streets, thousands of them. A nation of torches illuminated the night sky, and from the steps of the presidential palace, Traoré addressed his people by megaphone. "They want darkness," he said. "So let us show them our fire." That moment became legend. Images of Burkina Faso glowing under the stars flooded social media. The world saw a leader who would rather light 1,000 flames than surrender to fear. The people stood taller. Traders reopened stalls by candlelight. The message was clear. Sanctions cannot stop a soul that burns for freedom. But behind that defiance, a new storm brewed, one even Traoré couldn't predict. A mysterious convoy appeared near the Niger border, armored trucks with no insignia, moving under night skies. Intercepted communications suggested U.S. mercenaries, backed by unknown financiers, had entered the Sahel. Their mission: destabilize Burkina. Faso's government before the Gold Africa Initiative could take effect, and within days, explosions rocked 2 gold refineries in the north. It was chaos. The markets crashed. Families fled. The dream was collapsing. In the capital, Traoré sat alone, staring at the burning horizon. His reflection flickered in the window, tired, scarred, but unbroken. He whispered to himself, "They think power lies in fear. But fear is the weapon of the weak." He called for an emergency council. Generals, economists, and engineers gathered under candlelight once more. One of them, young and trembling, asked, "What if we lose everything, sir?" Traoré's gaze hardened. "Then let the world see how Africa rises with nothing but faith." And as he spoke those words, a coded message was already transmitting, not to Washington, not to the IMF, but to every African capital. "Stand with us. Not tomorrow, tonight." By morning, 7 nations had responded. Ghana, Mali, Niger, Chad, Senegal, Tanzania, and Ethiopia all pledged support. They called it the Unity Pact. And with that, the continent began to move. In Nairobi, workers refused to handle American cargo. In Lagos, protesters burned tariff documents in the streets. In Accra, students painted murals of Traoré beside Sankara, under one phrase, "Africa bows to no man." As Washington scrambled to contain the fallout, the White House prepared one final blow, a televised statement that would end the standoff. Trump would address the world, exposing Traoré as a fraudulent dictator and threatening full economic isolation. But Traoré was already one step ahead. He arranged for a live global broadcast, 1 hour before Trump's speech. The title, "Africa Will Speak." The world waited. Cameras rolled. And when the feed went live, Traoré appeared, framed against the backdrop of thousands of torches. His voice was calm, steady, unflinching. "America builds walls," he began, "but Africa builds bridges, not of steel, but of spirit. The world froze. Trump's team hesitated. Markets halted mid-trade, and in that instant, Ibrahim Traoré had turned silence into strength, fear into defiance, and sanctions into fire. The stage was set for what would come next, the moment that would humiliate Washington, shake the dollar and leave Trump himself speechless. But that was the calm before the storm. The world confrontation, the day Traoré replied. A single broadcast that changed global power forever. The world had gone still. In Washington, the Situation Room was silent except for the hum of electronics. In Paris, diplomats crowded around television screens. In Nairobi, people huddled in cafes, eyes fixed on flickering broadcasts. Everyone waited for one thing, Ibrahim Traoré's reply. The man from a small, landlocked nation who dared to stand against the most powerful economy on Earth. The broadcast opened with a low hum, static, flickering like a heartbeat. Then, out of the dark, Traoré appeared. No grand stage, no teleprompter, no polished suit. Just a soldier's uniform, dust on his boots, and a single torch burning beside him. Behind him stretched an endless sea of people, farmers, miners, soldiers, mothers, each holding a torch of their own. A nation glowing in defiance, and as the world watched, Traoré began to speak, his voice steady, raw, and unfiltered. "When you placed tariffs upon us," he said slowly, "you thought you were taxing our gold, but you were taxing our hunger, our pain, our patience. You wanted to starve us into silence, but in that silence, we found our voice." The translation echoed in dozens of languages: French, Arabic, English, Swahili. Crowds across Africa erupted in applause. Traoré raised a hand for quiet. "We were told we are poor, that we own nothing. But today I stand before you to tell you, we are the owners of everything that grows, breathes, and burns on this land. We own our soil, our sky, our sweat, our soul." Then came the twist, the move no one expected. He gestured to a large steel case beside him. Two guards carried it forward and set it down. Traoré opened it, revealing bars of pure gold stacked neatly inside. "You wanted tariffs?" he said, eyes blazing. "Here's your payment." He lifted one bar toward the camera. "But it will not be in dollars. It will not be in debt. It will be in gold. The one thing your banks cannot print and your power cannot fake." The world gasped. In the White House, Trump's aides scrambled. "What is he doing? He's making a global statement. Sir, if he pushes this gold standard narrative, markets could..." But Trump cut them off, eyes narrowing at the screen. "Let him talk," he said. "Let's see what this boy thinks he can teach America." Traoré continued, voice deepening, tone shifting from calm to fire. "For centuries, Africa's gold filled your vaults. Our diamonds built your cities. Our oil lit your homes. Our cocoa sweetened your mornings. And what did we get in return? Debt, tariffs, chains. But from this day forward, Africa will no longer pay to be free." His hand struck the table. The echo rolled through the microphones like thunder. "We will trade in gold, not in permission. We will sell to the East, not the West. And we will rise, not as colonies, but as nations." Back in Washington, the room fell dead silent. Economists watching the feed began to panic. Analysts muttered about destabilization of dollar confidence, risk of African gold revaluation, potential domino effect in developing economies. But for the millions watching online, it wasn't about economics anymore. It was about dignity. A flood of hashtags erupted, while Africa will speak, da Traoré vs Trump, da gold revolution. Then, just as the energy peaked, Traoré leaned closer to the camera, eyes sharp, voice lowering to a whisper that felt like prophecy. "Mr. Trump," he said, "you built a wall to keep others out. But what if the world no longer wants in?" He paused. "You said America first. I say Africa forever." The line detonated across the world. The broadcast ended. No music, no credits, Just the lingering image of that gold bar reflecting the flames of 10,000 torches. In Washington, chaos erupted. Trump stormed out of his prep room, his own upcoming speech suddenly meaningless. Cable news networks scrambled to interpret what had just happened. Fox News called it an African stunt. CNN called it a geopolitical earthquake. But Bloomberg was the first to say it plainly. If Traoré's gold policy spreads, it could end U.S. monetary dominance. Within hours, gold prices skyrocketed to a 40-year high. The dollar dipped, and in a single evening, the man the world underestimated had shaken the foundation of global trade. But the story wasn't over, because while America fumed, the rest of Africa moved. Mali announced it was converting half its reserves into gold. Ghana followed, then Niger, then Tanzania. By dawn, 7 African nations had joined Traoré's Gold Africa Pact, publicly denouncing the U.S. tariffs and pledging to trade independently. The headlines screamed across the globe. Africa unites, defies American sanctions. Traoré's speech sends shockwaves through markets. Trump's tariff war backfires. Trump's advisors begged him to respond, to reclaim control of the narrative. "Sir, the press conference is ready," one whispered. But Trump just stared at the TV, frozen on a still image of Traoré's face. The torches behind him looked like stars. Finally, Trump muttered, "He played the whole world like a damn movie." He turned away. Speech canceled. Across Africa, celebrations broke out. In Ouagadougou, people danced through the streets, waving torches and chanting his name. In Ghana, murals of Traoré went up overnight. The Lion of the Gold Coast. In Kenya, students flooded social media with the words, "He spoke, and the world listened." Yet even in victory, Traoré stood apart, not celebrating, not smiling. He watched the fireworks from the presidential balcony, the glow reflecting in his eyes. His aide approached. "Sir, you've done it. You made history." Traoré didn't answer. He looked at the night sky and whispered, "History is not made by victory. It is tested by what comes after." He knew this was only the beginning, because every empire he had just humiliated would come for him next. The world trembled that night, not because of gold or tariffs, but because a single voice from a forgotten nation had broken the script. The story was no longer about power. It was about awakening, and though the White House lights burned late into the night, the flame that now burned across Africa could not be tariffed, silenced, or stopped. The night after the broadcast, Africa did not sleep. From Cape Town to Cairo, radios crackled with one name: Ibrahim Traoré. His speech replayed across every language, every border, every time zone. And for the first time in modern memory, Africa wasn't reacting to history. It was writing it. In Ouagadougou, dawn broke golden and still. The torches had burned through the night, but the city remained awake. Old women knelt in the dust and wept, whispering prayers for their ancestors, those who had died believing freedom was only a dream. On the horizon, the first rays of sunlight touched the broken rooftops and dry earth. And in that moment, it seemed as if the land itself exhaled. Burkina Faso had survived. In Washington, the silence was heavier. Reporters flooded the White House lawn, demanding answers. "Mr. President, is the tariff war over? Has the dollar been weakened by African gold?" But there was no response. Trump's scheduled statement was quietly removed from the official calendar. A leak from inside the administration later revealed what had happened behind closed doors. The president had asked his economic team one simple question: if Africa pulls this off, how much control do we lose? The answer had come in a whisper: "Sir, all of it." The world markets shook for weeks. Global investors panicked as new alliances began to form. Trade corridors connecting West Africa to Asia, shipping routes bypassing Europe entirely. And then came the unthinkable: China and India jointly recognized the Gold Africa trade bloc, offering immediate trade deals. Russia followed within hours, praising Traoré's courage against Western economic imperialism. The dominoes fell fast. The IMF sent envoys offering to renegotiate terms. The EU proposed tariff exemptions in the interest of stability. And just like that, the boy they once dismissed as a populist soldier had forced the world to bend. But Traoré's focus wasn't on celebration. He was rebuilding. Every gold credit minted now funded schools, hospitals, and railways. Farmers received fair payment for their crops. Engineers built new energy grids powered by sunlight, not sanctions. The world called it the Burkina miracle. But inside his office, Traoré called it justice delayed. He often stood at the window, watching the people below. Merchants shouting, children laughing, banners of red, green, and gold fluttering in the wind. Once, an aide asked him, "Do you ever feel afraid, knowing how many powerful men now want you gone?" Traoré smiled faintly. "If fear stopped our fathers, we'd still be slaves. Let them come. I am not defending a palace. I am defending a people." Meanwhile, across the continent, something deeper was awakening, a movement without name or leader. Students in Accra began teaching the Traoré doctrine. Artists in Lagos painted murals of African heroes reborn. Farmers in Mali organized cooperatives to protect local trade. It wasn't politics. It was faith. Faith that an African future didn't have to be borrowed or approved. But not everyone was celebrating. In the shadows of Western capitals, new meetings formed. Economic giants and private interests, humiliated by the collapse of their influence, began plotting their return. Leaked memos revealed projects codenamed Operation Reset, covert campaigns to destabilize the Gold Africa Alliance, to restore dependency under the illusion of aid. But every time they tried, it failed. Burkina Faso had become more than a country. It had become a symbol, and symbols are bulletproof. Months passed. Then, on the one-year anniversary of his speech, Ibrahim Traoré appeared again before the world. No stage, no ceremony, just him, standing before a new monument built in the heart of Ouagadougou, a towering sculpture of a hand, forged from recycled weapons, clutching a gold flame. He stood before it, microphone in hand, and began. "A year ago, they said we were finished, that our crops would die, our children would starve, our voices would vanish. But here we stand, not as victims of sanctions, but as survivors of silence." He paused. The wind rustled the flags behind him. "When they took our gold, they thought they took our power. But gold is only metal. Power is belief. And belief has returned to Africa." The crowd roared. Cameras broadcast his words across the world. This time, no one dared to censor or spin them. In the front row stood delegations from every corner of Africa. Presidents, ministers, soldiers, students. Traoré raised his right hand and declared, "We are not asking for equality anymore. We are creating it. We are not waiting for permission. We are writing history." And to those who still think Africa is asleep, he smiled. "Wake up before the lions do." The crowd exploded. Drums echoed through the capital. Flags waved like fire. That night, the African sky glowed brighter than ever, not from torches this time, but from lights, electricity, and hope. Across the ocean, Wall Street analysts studied charts that made no sense. Trade data from Burkina Faso showed record growth, yet no loans, no Western dependence. How? They asked each other. How did a nation once considered one of the poorest on earth rise against the odds? The answer wasn't in numbers. It was in the fire of a people who remembered what dignity felt like. In a quiet moment after the celebrations, Traoré returned to his old military quarters. He sat on a wooden stool beside his worn uniform and stared at the night sky. Outside, the chants still echoed. "Africa forever! Africa forever!" He smiled softly. "Thomas Sankara," he whispered to the wind. "We did not let your dream die." The wind carried his words, rustling through the trees, sweeping across fields, rivers. and mountains, as if the whole land was listening. Months later, the world would remember this period as the Gold Rebellion. Economists would debate it. Politicians would rewrite it, but the truth would remain simple. It was not a war of weapons. It was a war of will, and in that war, Ibrahim Traoré had done the impossible. He made a nation believe that freedom wasn't something to beg for. It was something to become. The final shot of the film fades to black, with Traoré's voice echoing softly. Empires rise and fall, but the heart of a free people beats forever.